Welcome to this Zoom lecture organised by Villa Albert Museum. As we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the site of the house and garden and Kew, who are the Wurundjeri people. I'm Andrew Dixon, the Secretary of the not-for-profit trust that manages the property. We're pleased that you've been able to attend this talk today and ask you to look at our events page for other lectures, workshops and exhibitions. Thank you, Mark, and I'd like to introduce you to Mark Weller, who's doing the talk today. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. So, good afternoon all. The aim of this presentation is to illustrate the broad differences between the different styles of period houses in Australia, or principally focusing on Victoria, but what we're talking about applies really equally elsewhere in other states as well. But we're stopping at World War II because that's where my level of interest and hopefully expertise stops. So what I'm going to do is to share a slideshow presentation, and I'm going to talk about each of the broad periods that are covered, show you some pictures of houses that represent those periods and some typical features of housing in those periods. And then at the end, I'll be very happy to answer questions. So if you'd like to save them up to the end. So if we could just make sure we all stay muted during the presentation, because can't have two people talking at once. So I think we'll get underway. So I'll share my presentation. So hopefully you can all see that. So the principal distinctions are the Victorian period, so up to the end of Queen Victoria's reign, 1900, Federation Edwardian, which is up to World War I, and the interwar period, which is obviously between the two world wars. Now, in the Victorian period, there was still a carryover at the very beginning of the Georgian and Regency architecture from Britain. And this is, we'll see some examples of this in a moment. And then the other sort of three broad styles of housing in Victorian period were the filigree ones, so-called, and I'll explain what that means, the Italianate and Rustic Gothic, not necessarily in chronological order. So just beginning with Georgian Regency period. So this is not actually in Melbourne, this is in Tasmania, in Ross. Characteristics of the Georgian period, very simple architectural lines, classical sort of decoration, if any, simple cornices, coins around the windows and doors that you can see, often with a portico, we'll see another example of that, and multi-pane windows. Here's a house, my favourite house in Australia. This is called Panshanger in Tasmania, near Longford. Absolute classic Georgian house. Albeit in England, Georgian houses were never really single story, but that's an Australian quirk, I suppose. So once again, very simple lines, a simple portico with typical Regency decoration on the corners, if you can see my mouse pointing there. Just one point I might mention is one nice thing about very early houses is that they had, instead of ordinary windows, they had French doors, which opened out onto terraces or verandas, which was a very nice, spacious sort of feeling. In Melbourne, we have Royal Crescent, I was going to say, Royal Terrace in Carlton, opposite the Royal Exhibition Buildings. Once again, very simple architecture and in fine condition. There's also a couple of houses in Carlton nearby, which fit into this period. In fact, you can see the date on that, I think, is 1854. So although Melbourne was well underway by this stage, it was still using this earlier style of architecture from England. Once again, the same characteristics of a handsome portico, coins around the windows and at the corners, and very simple pediment decoration. So the fact is, in Victoria, there's very little of this Georgian Regency architecture. So most Victorian architecture in the 19th century was Victorian. I just mentioned this. This is a Georgian fan light, so called because it looks like a lady's fan. And this is a window above a door, a front door. And these were typically opening or openable for ventilation purposes. This is actually in the doorway of the Johnston Collection House in East Melbourne, which is a Victorian house, but with very much Georgian features on the outside. So let's move on to the more typical houses that we find in Victoria and around Australia. Obviously, Sydney does have some of those Georgian places, but Tasmania is the best hunting ground if you want to go and have a look at them. So here's a typical house of this so-called filigree style, so-called because of the elaborate cast iron decorative work, and on the top, underpinning the veranda roof. Another example here which illustrates that better, because it's got all of these elaborate cast iron balustrade panels on the veranda, as well as the freezers for the veranda roofs themselves. Here we've got typically slate roofs, especially in the earlier Victorian era, and sash windows, not multi-pane windows. So you can see each of these windows here is a two sash window, and we'll see some of the other details a bit later. Here's a simpler house in Geelong, a timber Victorian cottage, weatherboard, but you'll note that the front wall looks like stone blocks, and that's what you're supposed to think. These are actually weatherboards made to look like stone blocks. It's called block fronted. Very curiously, though, they only ever fitted these to the front of the house, and the sides, if you look around the side, there'll be weatherboards. So it was very much a matter of facadism, which I might add also applies to the first house we saw there, the sandstone coloured house with the red posts. It's got cement render on the front wall with grooves marked in it called ashlar coursing to make it look like stone blocks. But when you look down the sides of the house, they're bricks. So the Victorians were very much into facadism. Here's a slightly grander house down in Geelong, a farmhouse. Once again, similar characteristics. I didn't mention the hipped roofs before. A hipped roof is where the roofs, all the outer edges slope in towards common points, as opposed to open gables, which we'll see in later periods. And this house also, of course, has cast iron veranda posts and lacework and so on. Quite often elaborate chimneys, a lot of chimneys in this house. So slightly later in the 1900s, the 1800s, the 19th century, was this Italian period where a lot more use of cement render for decorative reasons. So you can see mouldings around tops of windows. You can see my pointer and this window at the bottom here. Also tendency to have arched top windows, either round arches or half round ones, but still having, in some cases, cast iron lacework. Here's another example, perhaps more typical of the Italianate, where we have colonnades. So no cast iron lacework in this house at all. This has got a veranda which is colonnaded like the monasteries and so on of old. Also, we've got towers appearing. So tended not to have towers on the earlier filigree style houses. And these houses were often associated with the so-called boom period. So the considerable wealth that came from the gold mining that led people to build big houses and have towers and so on to decorate them. Now, as well as that, there were also some of these so-called rustic Gothic houses that were built in the 1800s. And this one is in Hawthorne, and it's characterised by the fact that it's got open gable ends on the roofs here. It's got 3 open gables, which is quite different to the typical Victorian era. It's also, it's got cast iron work, but you'll note that it's become rather more geometric rather than stylised flowers and so on. This house is curious as well in that of these 3 gables, you note one of them has got timber fretwork for this barge board, which is very much a Regency feature that you see a lot of in Tasmania. But the other 2 gable ends are rather more elaborately moulded. Here's another example in the Western District near Winchelsea of a Victorian Gothic house. So once again, open gables, steeply pitched roofs, cast iron lacework, which is once again more geometrical in shape than in the filigree places. And we still have, of course, double hung windows. All of these houses, I think we've seen, have had slate roofs, but in fact, corrugated iron was very authentic, especially in the country, and it's a perfectly appropriate material to use today. So just running through, emphasising some of the typical features of these Victorian era places up to 1900. I think someone's got a microphone on. So this is the cast iron lacework. So you can see stylised designs of usually floral in nature, and there are hundreds of these designs because there used to be lots of cast iron foundries. There were quite a number in Melbourne, and each of the big country towns had several, and I think there's only one left now, and that's in Castlemaine in Victoria, and they all had their own designs. So this is why you see lots of different patterns even in the one street. This house, this is a cast iron veranda post, but timber houses would have had wooden posts, generally speaking. Interior, commonly in a Victorian house, there were ceiling roses, not necessarily as elaborately shaped or painted as this one, but they all had a ceiling rose in the middle of the room from which the light would hang. And by the way, a lot of these were perforated around the top here to allow fumes from the gas lighting to ventilate into the roof space. One of the characteristics of these is that each of these leaves was cast off-site. They probably bought them already cast, and then were glued in position by the plasterer on site. So each of these components is separately applied. For smaller houses and for later ones, they tended to be cast as one whole piece, and that was then glued up, and you can buy them that way today. I don't think you can buy any of these individual pieces today, but you can certainly buy quite elaborate ceiling roses that are as an integrated unit. Here's another one, a different pattern of rose, you see, and also you can see different opportunities for decoration in terms of the paintwork. Might also mention the light fitting. Victorian era light fittings are of course gas because we didn't have electricity at that point. So all the lenses face upwards, and because the gas flame obviously has to burn upwards. And the gas was delivered to the light via the pipe coming down from the inside of the ceiling down the pipe into the light fitting. The ceilings and the walls. So this is a cornice here, which is quite an elaborate cornice, but a very typical Victorian cornice. So if you can see my pointer, this is one large piece of plaster with a, whoops, I didn't mean to do that, with a curve here a cove, which is curved, concave, and there are lots of different sizes of these. They can be quite small or they can be quite large. And as you can see as well, there's an extra piece of moulding, moulded plaster applied onto the ceiling itself, this greyish piece. As well as that, you can see there's stenciling applied to the ceiling. So this is a simple stencil decoration with a border and an anthemion flower in the corner. Obviously, some places like Villa Alba have elaborately stenciled ceilings all over the ceiling itself. So this is a much simpler arrangement in a residential house, and sadly, of course, most of these disappeared by being painted over. This has been reapplied. I'll show you as well, Victorian houses always had a frieze, stenciled or wallpapered immediately below the cornice. And these were generally about 300 millimetres wide, a foot or so. Or for a very, very large mansion, they might be 18 inches wide. And typically, and we'll see in another picture, a picture rail would be fitted immediately below the frieze. This is another house. This is in the Western District, and this is wallpapered. Very elaborately painted for the cornice, but then there's wallpaper on the ceiling and a wallpaper frieze, and then the wallpaper body of the wall. A pretty busy room. I remember being in this room. Now, lesser rooms didn't have cornices, but they still didn't want to not have them decorative. And so this was a stencil that was in this house, covered up with wallpaper, and when revealed, this was the pattern, so it was able to be redone. So that runs right up into the corner with the ceiling, and then you see there's a panel or a section of the ceiling painted as a border to distinguish it from the wall, with these little decorative items stenciled in the corners. So this is a point I'll make. I'll mention further about the question of cornices. Here's another bit of stenciling, and this is actually the bottom half of the wall, the dado, which runs up to about the level of the mantelpiece, between the mantelpiece and the skirting board. And so it's very unusual to see stenciling of this extent. So usually you see a stencil at the frieze at the top, and it was very common to have a stenciled dado line, this pink line, which is about 150 millimetres wide, but pretty rare to have it all stenciled down here. Nearly all Victorian houses had a hallway arch, and this was designed to separate the public areas of the, if you like, from the private parts of the house. So generally visitors wouldn't proceed beyond this archway. So the sitting room or dining room would be where we're on the left and right, where we are now. And there was usually a big heavy curtain, a pair of curtains hanging behind here to perform that separation. Now, it's very common not to have any cornice decoration in the hall behind or in the rooms behind this. This house actually does, but even some quite large houses I've seen don't have any plasterwork towards the back of the house. Once again, facadism. We decorate all the bits, like you can see here, the hallway at the front and the front rooms, but where the family lives, it's much simpler. And here's a typical corbel, a bracket holding up the arch. And obviously there are opportunities to paint these decoratively, as there is with all of the plasterwork. Classic Victorian marble fireplace, quite a grand one, and with a cast iron grate filling the opening and a tiled hearth. Here's a polished timber mantelpiece. This is actually cedar with oak panels in it. And once again, a cast iron grate that fills the opening with, and these are original tiles on the hearth. And the reason I'm showing you this is because when we see the Edwardian ones, they're different. Victorian house had 4 panel doors, and the 2 lower panels are smaller, shorter than the upper ones. Curiously, the Edwardians also had 4 panel doors, but they basically inverted them and had the small panels at the top. What this obviously did was move the rail up higher, which meant that the doorknob ended up being much higher up. And I can only think this was done to stop small children being able to open doors. I can't see any other particular reason for doing it. Here's a front door. A Victorian house, once again, a 4-panel door, and typically, and even small cottages or terraces would have side lights, although a small place might only have a side light on one side. So these were in coloured glass, blue, red, amber or green, and always acid etched. So this is not lead lighting, this is etched glass with a Grecian urn and stylised flowers climbing up out of it. The fan light here, still called a fan light even though it's not shaped like that pretty lady's fan. Once again, this is opening. You might be able to see here, this is the knob with a screw that enables you to open it, and it's actually hinged on the bottom for ventilation. And that's glazed with acid etched daisy pattern glass. So each of these little discs is a daisy flower. They were sometimes also etched with a geometric pattern. Gates and fences. So Victorian era houses typically had picket fences and picket type tops shaped rather like this and with a substantial framed gate and cast iron tops on the posts and so on. We'll also in a moment see some Palisade fences, which were generally on more expensive houses. And they are the ones with the cast iron spears and cast iron posts and so on. For smaller cottages, they wouldn't have tended to have a framed gate like this. They just have a simple timber frame and it'd be covered with pickets like the rest of the fence. So moving to the period, the Edwardian period, which especially in New South Wales tends to be called the Federation period. Victorians tend to refer to it as Edwardian. And you'll see it says it starts in 1890 to 1915. Well, it sort of starts then. The fact is that when Queen Victoria died, there wasn't the rule that everyone had to stop building Victorian-style features into houses. And indeed, they'd started 10 or so years before that with some variations. And so we've got this distinct crossover where you have some houses having mixtures of Victorian features and Edwardian features. And there are 3 sorts of, similar to the Victorian era, 3 sorts of styles that appeared along the way in this era. So this is the first and quite typical sort of house. Well, not really typical, not many houses had these conical sort of decorations, but it was quite common if they were going to have any sort of decoration that it didn't have any function. It wasn't a lookout tower or anything, it's just a foible. And this house got a slate roof, so this is probably quite an early Edwardian house. And it's got open gables though. So this is where we stop having hipped roofs, where the roofs all slope into central points. You have these open gables here and then another one over here. You probably can't see too well here, but next pictures will show better. This has got timber fretwork for the veranda frieze instead of cast iron lacework. And this house actually has a palisade fence that I was just talking about. Once again, that really belongs to an earlier period, but the crossover, there was nothing to stop people still fitting those sorts of features. Here's another Edwardian house, once again, still with a slate roof, but you'll notice here we've got now some terracotta decoration appearing on the ridge cappings, and up here as well, and here. The open gables quite often had sort of half timbered effect with timber elements, and in between cement render, often in rough cast or pebble dash finish, which you've probably seen. This house has a bullnose profile veranda, which a lot of people think a standard old house veranda is always a bullnose. Well, in fact, no. Only late Victorian or Edwardian ones had bullnose verandas where it curves around like this. You'll see here too, we have some timber fretwork for the frieze holding the veranda up. Now, this fence is actually really a Victorian picket fence. And this is one of the things I find in my work is that lots of people, because they don't know the difference between the periods, they say, oh, I'd like a picket fence. And so this is what they get. Whereas you can have a picket fence, and we'll see in a moment what's the correct sort of one for an Edwardian house. Here's another Edwardian house, a simpler cottage. It's now got a terracotta roof, which is perhaps more typical of Federation and Edwardian houses. You see the open gable again with the same idea of half-timbered arrangement here. And this has also got, this is a weatherboard house, and it's got some decorative weatherboards on these front faces, just as far as the window. And this little hood here is a very typical sort of window shade for Edwardian houses. Once again, timber fretwork for the veranda. Another quite grand Edwardian house. Once again, it's got slate roof, but you see with terracotta trimmings. It's also got this interesting arch arrangement, which is all timber around the front door. And there's a very good chance that this would be replicated in the hallway inside the house and maybe behind this bay window here. I might also mention the bay window. These are casement windows, so they're not lift up and down sash windows. These would be hinged on their edge and open out vertically. This house actually has a palisade fence, and it really shouldn't. You can see it's a more modern palisade fence, been built by someone later on. Lovely grand house in Hawthorne, once again with a foible, a little turret with no particular function except to look interesting. And terracotta roof, lots of interesting roof lines and lots of open gables and so on. This picket fence is correct. So simpler tops of the pickets and running along and maybe being shaped up towards the posts like that. So there are also quite a lot of, certainly around Melbourne, these arts and crafts houses where the theory was that we should be less fussy and should be more natural in the use of building materials and design. So it's a bit of a contradiction because this house, you see, has got much more simple design than most of the other Edwardian houses we've seen, although it's still got decorative terracotta ridge caps, you can see. But their fretwork is very simple, simple lines and no fuss. However, do you notice we've got another Victorian picket fence here, which this really should have a much more simple angular type of picket fence. Here's a very different house, arts and crafts. This is near Griffith in New South Wales, a giant farm and a pretty giant house. And the owners told me that all of the stone was quarried on the property and all the timber was milled on the property. And it's apparently very good timber. They've not had any rot at any stage since it was built well over 100 years ago. And so this is a little bit Edwardian, but it's also perhaps arts and crafts as well. And it's got relatively simple lines. It's got little bits of decoration, but it's all about simplicity and grandeur in the process. So running through just some of the typical features of this period, I've mentioned the timber fretwork. So this could take all sorts of designs. Here's a house with a combination of just vertical shafts, as it were, and then panels with cutouts. I haven't got lots of pictures, but I can assure you, a lot of them were just simple ladder-type fretwork, but some had turned bobbin-type columns along the way. Here's another example with quatrefoil cutouts there, you can see. Another point here in this photograph is the tuck pointing. And tuck pointing was done generally only in the very late Victorian or Edwardian periods because bricks in those days weren't wire cut, so they weren't clean, sharp edges. And if you wanted clean, sharp edges, well, you had to get tuck pointing done. And what that entails is the tuck pointer, it's a very specialised skill, mixes up a mortar that's the same colour as the bricks and fills the gaps, the mortar gaps, so hides the mortar. And then once that's dry, he then applies this white or sometimes black special mortar to make straight lines to make it look all very regular and neat. It's a very smart effect, very labour intensive, as you can imagine. Fireplaces, I mentioned before that these are different. So nearly always the Edwardian period fireplace is much narrower. They fit in the same size opening, which is about 900 mils wide, but they always had rows of ceramic tiles up each side of the grate. And there were lots of different designs for these grates, of course, too. The plasterwork inside, this is a cornice, if you can imagine looking up into a corner. Simpler generally than Victorian era ones. Light fittings. Here's a light fitting which is all the lenses are facing down. And this is because this is electrified. So it's actually called an electrolier, whereas those Victorian ones, of which I showed you a picture, are actually called gasoliers. And it's interesting that apparently when electricity came along, lots of people with Victorian houses, when they converted their gasoliers into electroliers, they actually swung the arms around, these arms here, to face downwards to show off their globes, their electric light globes to their visitors. But this one was obviously designed from the beginning to be an electric light. Oh, there's a picture rail that I mentioned before. Brass rail with nice finials on the ends. You have rings along it and can hang paintings like in art galleries. Beauty is you don't have to bang holes in the wall to make hooks. Here's a very typical Edwardian fence in that it has the capping rail on the tops of the pickets. It's not so typical having these very smart brackets that you can see on each side of each post. So this is a rather smarter affair, but Edwardian picket fences generally did have a capping rail, or if they didn't, they were just very simple, like the big house we saw before when I pointed out the straight row of pickets. LED lighting appeared in this period. In fact, it appeared in the sort of late 1890s onwards, and quite common in lots of Edwardian era houses, in the front doors or in windows above the tops of windows, above casement windows, in bay windows in front rooms and so on. So the final era is the interwar era, and there are these several styles that you can see, and we're going to talk about each of these in turn. So it's basically between the two world wars. Now, having said that, of course, some of those Edwardian and even Victorian features might have still strayed into this period. But generally speaking, houses conform to one of these designs. So first we'll look at is the Californian Bungalow. And so these tended to have fairly simple decoration. They tended to have big open gable ends in the roofs, and as you can see, a very big open gable over this veranda and the front door and so on. This house also has a bay window, which was quite common. Perhaps the defining characteristic, if you're ever uncertain, is the veranda posts, because these were always quite substantial affairs. Always heavy masonry at the bottom, either bricks or stonework or concrete, surmounted by timber or masonry columns above. Here's an example. This is a timber house, but it's still got brick, very substantial pillars with just very short upper pillars holding the veranda roof. So it's this relatively heavy design. You'll see another example in a moment. Here we have the open gable with simple lattice here as a ventilator, and just very plain panelling with vertical strapping. We've also got different window arrangements in this period. These may be sash windows, and they're quite often a fixed window in the middle and little sash windows on either side. Here's another one, a slightly larger, grander house, and you can see its massive veranda posts. There are 4 of them here. They're very, very substantial. This one, they probably suit the house a bit better than those others, which they quite often look a bit clumsy because they're a bit too substantial for the house. This one seems to be a bit more harmonious. We've got the same arrangement of the vertical half-timbered sort of look, and shingles appearing here, which was quite common in this period to use shingles in the open gable. And terracotta roofs, probably the most typical, or corrugated iron. And the sharp ones will notice, see there's a sash window there in the veranda. So various window styles used. Very common, certainly in Melbourne, is the Old English sort of revival, where we had these clinker brick houses, nearly always clinker brick, and very substantially built. I might add, all of the brick houses in the interwar period are solid brick and very well made, usually with quite tall ceilings, 9'6", and relatively spacious houses and nicely constructed. So here's a house, terracotta roof, open gables, albeit they're bricked all the way up to the top of the gable, as you can see. And this one has sash windows. I can hear some noise. Could someone who's not got your microphone muted, just mute that, please, so we don't have interference? Thank you very much. Here's another example where you've got a combination of cement render and bricks, but it's still a solid brick house underneath. Another example, this is a small block of flats, often with this sort of Tudory look incorporated, half-timbered arrangement. There's also a few houses around that are so-called Georgian Revival, and this is in Brighton. Very simple design, almost no decoration. This one doesn't even have any sort of an architrave or cornice at the top, rather, cornice. It's just a simple eave. But it does have a nice little portico, and it has the multi-pane windows. Not really a lot of those around. But there are quite a lot of these. The Spanish Mission house, this is in Camberwell, and there are lots around Camberwell, but in other places too. So characterised by arched windows, archways over porches, terracotta roofs, pretty common, and usually cement rendered, either in smooth render or rough cast. Another example, in fact, here's one where you can see the rough cast cement render that I mentioned, and colonnade type effect. And as well as that, we had the modern sort of so-called houses where there was a focus on horizontal lines and smooth curves. Horizontal line and also vertical lines. You see this is a stairwell here. And so this it tended to accent these either vertical features or these horizontal features. See that line of bricks running around there. And there was also a small number of houses that you would think this might have been built today, with because it looks very similar to lots of architecture going up around. But this is actually in Glen Iris, and it was built before World War II. So quite box-like, but very functional, and that's hence the name. And you see it's got a simple fence that perfectly matches the house itself. So just a few typical features of the interiors. This was the Art Deco era. And so virtually all of these styles had plasterwork such as this, which had, instead of having elaborate flowers and things around the ceiling rows, had these geometric arrangements instead. And this is quite a smart one. And these central panels took all sorts of shapes, but they were always geometric. And you will see this ceiling also has this decorative border set well in from the cornice. And by the way, these were never painted in multiple colours because they're nearly always just painted white like the ceiling, and the shadow effects, dark and shade, are what gave them their interesting appearance. A lead light appeared, but it's gone away from those stylised flowers of the Art Nouveau into Art Deco, much more geometric in design. So some quite attractive, like this one. And here's a very geometric design. Followed up here, and very common in these houses was to have a pair of these glazed French doors from the hallway into the sitting room, and then another matching pair from there into the dining room. And quite a lot of these are still intact, even with the original glass, which is remarkable that they've survived so long, and families and children running around them and so on. Quite a nice feature. It's also quite common in this period to have quite substantial stained timber overmantels over fireplaces, and indeed whole hallways were panelled very often up to this plate rack. So this, it's a bit hard to tell from the picture, but you can see there is a pot standing in the corner there. So this is comprised a vertical section and a horizontal shelf with little timber brackets holding it. And they ran around the wall and were often used as well to hang pictures. I imagine great dust collectors. Here's another ceiling, slightly more flamboyant with this bow here. But nevertheless, this is very clearly an Art Deco ceiling. And by the way, there's a typical light fitting from this period, the mottled glass bowl, which came in different shapes, hanging on chains from the ceiling. Here's a very simple cornice and a very dusty ventilator. Once again, reflecting this less elaborate decoration. So, what I've attempted to do is not to give you a totally comprehensive description of every single difference between all the periods, but to give a flavour of the sorts of distinguishing features that you can recognise by looking at these period houses. So just before we open up for questions, might just mention that my service is just an advisory service. I don't actually fix your ceilings, but I can help you identify what's original and what's not, give you options for replacement or repair. The fact is that many of these houses have been altered enthusiastically or butchered over the period. Verandas fall down and get replaced with non-original ones or modern ones. Fireplace get removed and then people don't know what should go back. So I suppose that's the largest focus of what I'm helping people to do. And if people often don't want to make alterations and extensions, well, you don't necessarily have to do wholesale demolition. of the back of the house, it's quite often possible to be more conservative, and we can talk about that sort of thing. We can talk about gardens and fences and exterior structures. And I can also help source items, if you don't know where to look, of fittings and features and antique furniture and so on. And finally, I also run education sessions for organisations like real estate agents who want to inform their staff of what's what. So that's the end of the presentation. And I'm very happy to answer any questions you might have and explore any areas I haven't covered. So over to you. So you need to unmute yourself. If you perhaps wave your hand if you want to ask a question. And yes, Elizabeth. Need to unmute your microphone.
Oh,
that's
right.
it.
I was just going to ask about the polychromatic brickwork when that came in. It seems pretty typical around Hawthorne.
Yes, probably later, but that's not absolute. I wouldn't say black and white that it's any particular period. It's certainly Victorian, and I think this house I showed in the two-storey house with the big veranda in Hawthorne Grove might have had some polychrome brickwork. Probably later rather than earlier, but not absolutely. Did I see another hand waving? Yes, Kate? Yes, Kate? Kate Gower, yes, your microphone is on, so you can ask a question.
I was just, my apologies. In doing walks, I'm only interested in walking around there, see blocks of air at these particular sites.
I'm sorry, I'm having trouble hearing you, Kate. I think she's giving up. So, Robert, hello.
Don't worry. Sorry.
Yes, Robert, your microphone's on, so I should be able to hear you.
No.
No, I'm sorry. You're talking away, but I can't hear a word you're saying. Just check your microphone. If you see the mute symbol down the bottom left of your screen, if you wiggle your mouse, there's a little arrowhead next to it. Just click on that and you'll see some options which might help you to fix your microphone. So are there any other, hello Libby, I didn't see you there before.
Hello. Yes, I'm interested in a 1850s house, 1858. What kind of fireplaces would it have? Because I think from memory, these might have been put in a bit later because some of them have got tiles down the side. What would a house of that first 1850s era fireplace be like?
Well, definitely there wouldn't have been tiles down the side until 1890 onwards.
Okay.
So it will have been one like the an arched grate. I'll just quickly show you. I'll just quickly share this. Oh, what's happened? Sorry, I've got the wrong one there. One second.
Okay. Certainly no marble.
No, well,
but there's a black. One of them's got a black with almost a yellow line through it. Maybe it's false marble.
it could be. So I didn't mention that. There were. I showed you this one, and I also showed you the timber one here.
Yeah, there's one like that, but no timber. What
do you mean? It's faux. So
well, it's got the central grey fire support,
yes.
But there's no timber on the outside. It's, well, I suppose there is, but it's a painted timber. It's not a decorative one.
Right. Now, having said that, though, if we go back to the marble one just now, it was quite not at all uncommon for people to have faux marble. So where this mantelpiece or fire surround is timber, but painted to look like marble.
Okay.
And in fact, in my house, I've got one painted to look like granite. It's an original item. So it was very common. And if it were well done, it's very convincing.
Mm.
So the point is that Victorian ones either had round ones or had all cast iron, but no ceramic tiles.
Okay.
So any other questions? Robert, have you managed to...
I had a quick question.
Yes.
My house is from about 1885 and I'm looking at putting stained glass in the hall door. I wondered if the red and blue glass was typical for that period or was it not quite the right time?
Sorry, what period again?
1885.
Yes, it would have been. I mean, are we getting some echoing here? Kate, oh yes, that should be better. The etched coloured glass would be typical. I don't think lead lights started appearing till a little bit later, but it is possible. But more prior to 1890, I would have thought the coloured glass is the way to go. And there are people who do this etching now. They do it by sandblasting because the acid etching was using, I think, hydrochloric acid or sulfuric acid, which was rather dangerous. So they can replicate what was there or make new design for you if that's what you want.
Can I ask another couple of quick questions?
Of course, Libby.
Getting back to the 1850s house, what would its fence be like?
Is it a brick house or a timber house?
It's a brick. Well, I don't know. It's maybe, I don't know, maybe it's concrete. No, it's probably brick, but rendered.
Right. Well, the reason I ask is if it's a timber house, it would invariably have had a timber fence, a picket fence. But brick house, there's a choice of either picket fence or a palisade fence if it's a substantial property, or a masonry fence. So bricks and rendered, which you see a lot of people are putting up nowadays if they're on busy roads for privacy, with a moulded tops on the fence and so on. But there is choice there for that at that period.
Okay.
And if it's really early, the pickets might be just simple pointed top.
Yes. Okay.
Pickets.
Can I ask another question too?
Of course.
Kincora Road, Liz and I were doing our usual walk and stop and look at every house and take a photo. And a number of them had their cast iron in a really distinctive design. Is it like grapes hanging on every third or fourth drop, or a sort of like a cone almost? Is there anywhere where you can ascertain who that would have been in their catalogue? Do you know what I mean? That you were saying they were distinctive styles.
Yes, a lot of them were numbered actually, but of course there's so much paint on them now it's impossible to work it out. There's a man who wrote books on cast iron, decorative cast iron in Melbourne. And I think his book, we're actually going to provide to you by email after this a list of books that you might be interested in referring to on which cover the different periods. I don't think that's one of them, but I can add that to the list or let you know.
Thank you.
This was an expert. He did a lot of work on researching cast iron in Melbourne and talked about the different designs and manufacturers and so on. So it might be possible to find it that way. So, Kate, do you want to have another shot at asking your question? Kate? No. Any other questions? Libby, you've got another one?
No, I think I was just waving. Sorry.
Yes, Lisbeth.
I've just got I did have another question. I was wondering about the interwar verandas and the heavy posts and so on. They were not structural, I presume. They were really just decorative.
Oh no, they're structural, but they didn't need to be as strong as they are.
Right. Okay. Okay.
I mean, they did have to be more substantial sometimes than perhaps the Victorian veranda post, because Victorian veranda post is just holding up the width of the veranda roof, which is a pretty shallow, slender structure, whereas those Californian bungalows, it's often the main roof running right down, and therefore there's quite a lot of weight at the corners. But I'm sure they didn't need to be as massive as most of them are.
Okay, that's fine.
Good question.
Thank you.
Mark, what about the ripple iron fence that's on Como? What period would that belong to?
Yes, I couldn't really say. And I should have thought about that. So ripple iron is the narrow pitched version of corrugated iron, which can look quite smart if it's mounted in a frame with a capping rail and between posts. I really don't know, Margaret. Sorry, I can't answer your question. But I'll see what I can find out. So, Robert, do you want to have another shot at trying to ask a question?
Can you hear me now?
I can, yes. Yes.
We have a photograph in our collection of a block-fronted Edwardian house, and the blocks are picked out in different colours to the background. And I wondered whether this was typical, so that it's a dark background and then the block-fronted wooden sections are a pale colour.
I think that quite possibly was authentic. I haven't talked about colours and painting today because we could talk for hours about that. But certainly up until the Edwardian period, there was, when people could afford it, they did do more decorative things. So hence stenciling inside, elaborate painting of cornices and ceiling roses and things, and the same for outside. So the example I showed of the veranda post with the lacework, that was just two colours. The posts were one colour, they were red, if you remember the picture, and the lacework was greenish colour. And then the timber framing was, I think, a cream colour. But some houses actually painted the flutes of the veranda posts with a different colour, you know, a stripe down the same goes for the panels around the front door. Sometimes the frames on the panel, the mouldings around each panel were painted a different colour to the rest of the door. I wouldn't have thought it was very common for the block-fronted houses to do that, but I have seen it done, and I think it probably was done occasionally in the past, you know, at the time.
Thank you.
One of the important things about paint colours for external items is that they need to bear a relationship to the house. You don't want to be introducing new colours that are not germane to the house. So, for example, that veranda post that was red or Indian red with the green lacework, well, all the joinery, the windows and the door frames and so on were all the Indian red as well. And the same applies inside. In a Victorian house, say, or in an Edwardian one for that matter, the colours that you paint the ceiling decoration and the cornices and things need to bear some relationship to, say, the skirting boards or the architraves and doors, rather than introducing completely new colours that are, because you end up, there's a great potential to end up with a mishmash. And I'm sure a lot of you have seen houses where people have gone to great lengths to paint their cornices and ceiling roses and things in multiple colours, and sometimes it ends up being not so successful because it's too contrived or doesn't bear any relationship to the rest of the room. So does that sort of answer your question, Robert?
Yes, it does.
So Alison, did you have any questions from the South Coast of New South Wales? Put you on the spot. I think she's run away. So if there are no other questions, we might bring proceedings to an end.
There was just the one, if you're there.
Oh, you are there? Oh, good. Yes,
yeah. I was thinking when you were talking, Mark, about the interwar houses and the other houses as well, you see, like in Melbourne, you see a whole street of Spanish Mission or a whole house of bungalow. Was it driven by developers and builders like it might be now when you see new estates?
I think very likely.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very common to see two houses side by side, identical in design.
Yes. Yeah.
Not even reversed pattern, you know, they.
Yeah.
And it happens today. I mean, and that's just lazy builder developers.
Yeah.
But equally too, the reason whole streets are Californian bungalows is because that was a subdivision often.
Yes, yeah, as has been now with the new style. Yeah.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, fair enough. Good. Thank you. That was very interesting. Thank you.
Good. So now, Kate Gow, you keep waving. So do you want to try and ask your question again?
I'm sorry about this. I'm in my car, so
I can hear you now. That's much better.
Yes, all of a sudden I can hear you better too. I was wondering if you could recommend any walks so that you could walk around a particular suburbs. I'm only new to Melbourne and I would like to be able to go and observe certain areas. Like in Sydney, you had Five Dock as a garden suburb for Art Deco type houses.
Yes, well, there are historical societies scattered around Melbourne. One of them is in Hawthorn, and we have two of the ladies officiating there here today, Elizabeth and Elizabeth. And they actually do walks. In fact, did that one ever happen that got cancelled and postponed multiple times thanks to the plague?
It's coming up.
Can I answer that?
Yes.
6th of March. If Kate gets in touch with the Hawthorn Historical Society, you can book in to come on a walk down King Cora Road on the 6th of March.
Okay.
It's the day of the Glen Free Festival, but never mind. We'll work around that.
Thank you very much.
So, Kate, if you look up on the internet, Hawthorn Historical Society, you'll find their website. It's a good place to start.
Thank you very much, all.
And you'll probably find a similar one in Collingwood and Fitzroy, I would expect.
Thank you.
So, any other questions? So, as I said, Andrew will send you an email with a list of books that you might like to find. They're not likely to be in print, but they're likely to be in your library, or you might be able to buy them secondhand on the internet. Bookfinder.com is a good place to look. Andrew, do you wish to say anything in conclusion?
So I'm trying to get my video to start.
Well, it's not, but you're talking anyway. We can hear you.
Mark, thank you very much for your talk today. We really do appreciate the effort that you've put into preparing the talk. Lots of lovely pictures. You know, some of those houses I'd never seen before. Mark loves travelling around the countryside looking at grand houses. So we've had a little grand tour without having to get in the motor car and go there ourselves. Very, very, very nice. So, Mark, on behalf of everybody that's enjoyed the talk today, thank you very much for all your work. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thanks, Mark. Excellent.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you very
all.
much.
Thanks, Mark. Bye.
See you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.